Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. I'm your host, Dan Snyder, and today is a special one. Across every thematic season of Comet's own discernment of our times, this podcast, as the magazine's more personalist accompaniment, is ever interested in the people and organizations that help others live lives that are more integrated, self-giving, and whole. At the same time, such people and the ways in which they are swimming upstream in our world are thickening and strengthening our social and political fabric, not tearing it, or, in some ways worse and a lot more normal, simply not attending to it. A lot of the time, for this kind of constructive reweaving work, you need the ballast and coordination of healthy institutions. But you also need leaders and followers embedded within these institutions who are self-regulated, dependable, peaceful, and wise. You need humble but directed folks who are not thrown off by fads or superficial thinking, those who can thread through the tactical, practical, and no good options of these tumultuous times and, at the same time, retain their integrity. How does one find such people and attract them to your institution's mission? Perhaps more importantly, how do you become such a person yourself? Most of you listeners know that I've spent some years studying character formation. One thing that I've come to see as most crucial, but often overlooked, perhaps especially as I reflect on the contingencies of my own life, is the importance of the background nudges of our lives, the ambiances, the organizational containers, the domestic cultures, and the accountability structures that nudge us toward life-giving habituation and not devolved desires that distract and ultimately harm us. One thing that has really helped me in this regard, especially in a job that is often remote from colleagues and yet substantively intense, is a paper-bound companion called the Monk Manual. A planner, I hesitate to call it a time management tool after last week's episode with Kelly Kapic on limits and human finitude. In many ways, as Kelly himself was urging us, the Monk Manual is trying to revolutionize our relationship to time, even remake our modern conception of it. But it is, on its face, a 90-day planner designed to bring the timeless wisdom of monastic living into your everyday life. It is a twist on what I sometimes say, that Adam 2 should be in service of Adam 1, that excellence should always be in service of love. In a culture and an era obsessed with efficiency, output, and speed, the Monk Manual says life isn't about getting to the end faster, it's about being there the whole time. Here's the opening page when you open the manual. Quote, "We find a radical way of living in monasteries, a way that flips contemporary thinking on its head. Where the world says focus on more, the monk says focus on less. Where the world seeks to master outcomes, the monk seeks to master self. Where the world fills our lives with noise and distraction, the monk fills his or her life with quiet and focus. Where the world pursues a life of independence, the monk pursues a life of trust, walking the path of life with God and others. Where the world medicates, the monk meditates. Monks are the most productive people in the world. They know that productivity isn't about doing more things, it's doing the most important things well." Steve Lawson is the author of these words and the creator of the Monk Manual. He has joined us today to describe the logic behind this tool and his journey to discovering that monks, in an age of nonstop speed and performative pressure, may just be the perfect people to nudge us in a direction more in tune with how we were created to live, labor, and love. Steve, it's so great to have you on the Whole Person Revolution. Thanks for joining.
Great to meet you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Steve, how did the monk manual come to be? Like, what was the need that you saw in the lives of others and maybe even experienced in your own life that led to its creation?
Sure. Well, I actually it's funny when people ask me what is the root of the monk manual. I'll sometimes struggle because I have it's almost like a culmination of everything in my life to a certain point, like a Venn diagram with 100 circles, right? And but there's particular things that I think impacted my course of life and ultimately led to the creation of the monk manual. One was in high school. I encountered this quote in English class by John Stuart Mill that went along the lines of, "I'd rather be a human being dissatisfied than a pig fully satisfied."
Hmm.
And I remember at the time it stuck with me and set me on a path to wanting to live out of some level of personal integrity and honesty, and in a sense, move towards whatever was true and real and the fuller potential that existed, even if that cost me certain illusions, even if that cost some level of even personal, maybe satisfaction in the moment. That set me on a path. Uh, it was a bit winding, but at a certain point, something that became a reoccurring pattern was a real interest in productivity, right? So I
Hmm.
got very, very invested in productivity thinking and trying to go, in a sense, reach a certain level of potential through optimizing myself, my life, right? Um, what ended up happening was I found myself becoming very good at churning out widgets, as to use them metaphorically, but uh, I was increasingly actually finding that I lacked a sense of personal peace.
Hmm.
And behind that, I realized that the original movement, even towards productivity, was actually a movement towards peace. I was thinking that if I became more productive at some point, I would go and be able to just have the peace that I imagined was at the end of the rainbow.
Hmm.
But it wasn't actually happening, right? So I realized something was broken in the way I was approaching productivity, in the way I was approaching time, and the way I was approaching work, because it wasn't actually leading me to that place of fulfillment or that place of peace, even though I felt like it should, right? Um, I also, around the same time, and for quite some time leading up to that, had been in, uh, really interested in just that best way to live and studying how that manifests in various wisdom and spiritual traditions, looking into a lot of psychology around what leads to human flourishing. I started seeing that there was actually a pretty strong convergence amongst uh, what seemed to be the formula for a really fulfilling life of flourishing. In that, surprisingly to me, it actually seemed to be monks that were getting it most correct in terms of how to structure one's life and structure one's time and even points of emphasis in
Hmm.
order to arrive at that desired end result of meeting a certain human potential. So I was really, really inspired by this vision of what monasticism promotes, and then even on some level, really inspired by um, maybe the potency of the monk itself as an image. What I mean by that is because monks are so alien to us, they actually point. They're kind of like a sign of contradiction to our culture, because everything that they do seems to represent a different value system, and because they're alien to us in some ways, they also stand out. Right? There's so much noise that you almost have to have something that kind of cuts through that and offers a different way to live. So I thought there was a real potency there. There's so much I could say about that, but I'll leave it there for now.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, I really identify with the last thing you just said. My husband and I created this ideal of a person that we call weavers, and you probably heard me use in my introduction that verb to reweave. Like, what does it look like to reweave our social fabric in our neighborhoods and all that? And it's a person that doesn't necessarily have like a title in an institutional sense. It's just someone who typically is a bit of a relational genius, and they know how to sort of re-knit broken things and broken sort of what lies between us and our fears and all of that. And we found that in trying to encourage sort of this attempt almost at like culture change, he initially was calling like Weave the social fabric project. And we figured out that it was actually much more inspiring and resonant with people if you just personified it and you said, do you want to be a weaver? And you described what those traits were. And people, it was just naming something. And similarly, I think holding up the monk, there's monastic life and monastic principles, but there's something about, I think, personifying these exemplars, even if they're a type that have existed throughout history, that give people something to sink their teeth into that somehow is more helpful than a rule book. So I just want to affirm that. I'm curious, as you sort of had this aha moment, or maybe it was gradual, of discovering the wisdom of monastic traditions that exist in a variety of different religions historically. Um, what was the literature where you were reading when you kind of landed there? Were you looking at like the diaries of monks? Were you looking at books about monasticism? Like, just as you were steeping in this, how did you learn about the rhythms of life that hold constant across time and arguably like religious tradition?
There's a guy I know who's a consultant, and one of his things is he says every person has a superpower, so kind of a signature trait or ability where they thrive on almost a supernatural level. And I don't know exactly what mine would be, but it's something along the lines of observing and recognizing patterns and seeing the deeper piece, almost like so I share that because on one hand I think I was actually just thinking a lot about the archetype of monks, and actually the monks I know, and what's going on there.
Yeah.
And it's maybe fairly intuitive, but being able to see maybe the intended functional elements behind a lot of the form. So it's like, okay, well, there's a certain fashion, but what was actually the goal of that, right? Or what is the goal of the particular structure? Like, what is it that actually is the system behind the thing? There's also an academic paper someone had sent me that was about how the rule of Saint Benedict was a form of spiritual technology, insofar as it was like this created thing that was made it easier to go and flourish as a human being. They were talking more in a spiritual perspective, but it was actually it was a fairly broad lens through its spirituality, kind of just the human spirit, right? Being able to actually thrive. And that really struck me that, okay, this is a system that goes and aids that. I think increasingly I was very aware of also maybe the role of stillness and how stillness impacts us, and how the lack of stillness impacts us, and not even from a standpoint of anxiety, which is how we normally think of it, but even life direction, even decision making, even discernment, even our belief systems, I think, are heavily impacted by the fact that we can't be still, as a trickle down effect. So thinking about stillness and the importance of that, I was studying quite a bit also in Buddhist monasticism, trying to see some of the overlaps between that and Christian. And then I also I spent about a year studying the spiritual and ethical development of children. So I was
fascinating.
So I was spending a lot of time trying to understand how children end up developing morally, ethically, and then also spiritually. I think that some of these micro patterns, when you understand the individual, you can also see kind of in a collective way where different people may be at in that, even as a culture, where are we in a certain development cycle? And then you can see what is actually most helpful.
Totally. Yes. There's a reason when I got on here, I said I felt like I was meeting a friend. I have no idea how much you're speaking my language right now. That's very cool. So I would love for you to explain for our listeners the core principle, and you used the word formula earlier, the core principle or formula that animates the monk manual. What is it and how does it work?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to maybe go about this. On a really meta level, the vision for the monk manual, how it would be different from maybe a normal way of approaching productivity or even time, is it's not so much built around how do you go and just get more done, but it's really focused on how do you get the right things done. So it's about intentionality, right? It's a like for example, a lot of people are used to maybe using a to-do list, right? And a to-do list it can be fine, it can be helpful for organizing thoughts, but it's not actually making you choose and prioritize things. And our life ultimately is choices, what we say yes to, what we say no to. So it's actually forcing you to go and in some ways take on your own personal agency to choose the things that you're going to invest your life in. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, though, is how you actually arrive at that is through what I call the PAR method, which is prepare, act, and reflect. And with the idea being that human beings can't help but act. Even if I laid down to took a nap, I would still be acting. We can't help but act, right?
Right.
A lot of productivity thinking, uh, even within businesses, a lot of thinking when we're thinking about trying to go and direct that action, there's a heavy emphasis on planning, right? Maybe there's strategic planning. Some people might plan out their week. They might plan out their meals for the week. There's a sense of, well, if I can go and foresee, I can go and make certain choices or guide my action. I have the agency to guide my action. But what I saw was there seems to be a missing piece to that in that without reflection, you actually can just move faster and faster, potentially in the wrong direction. There's a quote that may or may not have been said by Thomas Merton, but it's often attributed to him, the American monk, that goes something along the lines of, a lot of people spend their whole life climbing a ladder only to realize it's against the wrong wall. And that's one of the problems that can arise without the reflective piece, is because you're not necessarily taking the data to go and learn and reacclimate. And even tied to that, so on one hand, it's the discernment piece, it's the constantly realigning and reorienting your own personal compass, and in some ways you could argue the project of your life. But in addition to that, there's also something that comes from reflection, from a standpoint of actually being able to integrate the learnings in lessons, the teachings of the day, right? So just to kind of wrap that up, if you imagine yourself maybe racing through the day, almost being like driving down a highway at 100 miles per hour, you're going to miss a lot of the different signs around you, and you're probably not even going to enjoy the ride, right?
Yeah.
It's probably going to be fairly anxious. But life every single day has this opportunity for learning. There's so much data, right? There's so much data in our relationships. A lot of times things will happen in our life. We'll be like, I couldn't see that coming. Now, the thing is like, you probably could have actually, but you maybe weren't paying attention to a lot of the different signs, right? In the relationships, in your work, in yourself, right? And what's going on. So it's about slowing down, because you can go and try to increase your maybe like cutting speed, but sometimes it's actually spending more time measuring twice and cutting once. That's the more effective path, right? That actually being really intentional about action gets you closer to your goal, whatever that might be, versus just a frenetic movement.
I want to press in on this a little more, this notion of kind of personal agency. Speaking myself as someone who's in a position, not of humongous organizational leadership, but enough. There's like interior managerial, just like what it is to run something, as well as in my case, running a magazine, kind of public intellectual leadership. It just sometimes feels like there are so many demands, especially when your work, I just feel very lucky. I feel like what I get to do is a bit of a vocation or a calling. The demands, when you have that sense of motivation and actually love embedded in the labor, that feel like needs that you cannot ignore. Needs from people, needs from the challenges of the day, logistical complexities, etc. And I, of course, want to do the job well. I don't want to fail it, but I also feel this like intense sort of responsibility to respond with all the ways I've been formed to hopefully serve this moment in time in my tiny little way. And I have loved the Monk Manual for its ability to kind of help me discern that which is central and core and essential, and that which is peripheral. But I would just love your, as honestly as possible, even as you've been stewarding, you created this product, you've been stewarding its growth and also the growth of a company. I assume that the Monk Manual is now a thing out there, business. Like, how much agency can we really have? I mean, like, I'm curious if you've heard really encouraging or sometimes discouraging testimonies that is just like the honest human experience of people who use this tool, um, that something about the way in which it's forced them to prioritize, to think about what really matters, to align their doing and their being and their values with their action, et cetera, et cetera. Have they eventually been able to almost like shift some of the external structures, as whether it's their workplaces or their family lives or whatever?
So it's funny. I serve a lot of people who are either, I would call, and this isn't precise language, but like a doer who wants to be a better beer, or a beer who wants to be a better doer, right? Like they
That's
want to.
funny.
So
Yes.
it's someone who's like, I really struggle to go and get things done. I'm really good at being present, but I'm not. And actually, one of the things that's been really gratifying for me is trying to really understand the psychology of both, and because in both, usually the reason that I think people subscribe to a particular orientation of life actually is tied to beliefs. I do think that there's things like people can have a attention deficit disorder, whatever it might be, but I think that actually people settle into different ways of approaching life. Some are more proactive. Actually, in some ways, it actually I think is tied in part to anxiety and the anxiety of life. And for some people, we have a natural inclination to fight, whereas others it's to freeze, and to others it's to kind of run away. And these orientations lead us to engage life in different ways. A lot of people have a desire for closure, right? And there's an awareness that there's so much we have that should be done. It feels like it's essential to us, and there's just no way of doing it all, right? I have 3 kids. I have a wife. I have a business. I am constantly aware that in each of those categories, I'm not actually doing what I imagine I should do, right? Or imagine I could do, rather. So I think part of actually the journey is recognizing, and this is what I think the Monk Manual strives to do, is by forcing limits, by saying, hey, what's your 3 priorities? It moves you away in some ways subtly from that mentality of should do. Should do is kind of like could do with a little bit of shame added in, right? So the should do is the feeling of like, oh, I'm not really doing the magazine enough, or the podcast enough, or the website enough, or these ads, or this or that, or maybe I could be a better whatever, but there's always going to be that, right? I think a lot of people end up dying actually with a to-do list, right? So it's never going to fully end. Because what's interesting is when I was using the Monk Manual, even the first couple of years, there was one point where I was like, I actually am still feeling kind of stressed. Like I'm feeling a little stressed sometimes at the end of the day. And I was like, I don't know. And I take it personally when I go and put something out there and say, hey, go use this, is going to help you. It's very conflicting for me if I'm like, is this actually a good thing? Because I don't feel good if it's not actually a good thing. I realized, though, it was forcing me to be honest and actually to confront certain things. So it's not that the system was broken. It was just bring about certain honesty around things.
Yeah.
That was bring up some uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah.
And this desire to go and I guess complete all the things. So how that's resolved for me, and I would say it is still a struggle, right? Because I think it's not. I don't know if it's like a binary thing where it's either resolved or not resolved. I think it's like it's an ongoing process. But I think I've become more comfortable with living with the tension of just knowing I'm never going to be able to do everything, right?
Yeah.
I am a finite being with infinite dreams and potentialities. Something I don't remember who exactly this quote comes from. It might have been Heidegger, but every man is born 1,000 men, but dies a single one. So there's this awareness, right?
It's good.
That we have 1,000 different potentialities, and there's so many different life trajectories and itineraries we could take, and we have to choose. But in that is actually also the agency, because what happens is then you get to choose. Like you actually get to choose. And there's a burden to that. You can actually run away from that because it's a heavy burden. But there's also an incredible richness because you're very aware that like I only have this amount of time and I'm going to go and do these particular things. And then again, it's just discernment and recognizing I can't do all the things. What are the things that I feel like are the right things, right? If I can only do these three things, what are those things? I want to just wrap that with one final thing. Something I've been interested in, I've connected with some people in this space through the Monk Manual is this idea of like decluttering, right? Because decluttering is a really interesting thing. Often we think about it in terms of material goods. And what will happen is decluttering, you end up finding that all these objects, they have an emotional grip on you in some ways. There's maybe meaning behind them. Sometimes there's even identity caught up in them. So if you go and you look at something, you say like, hey, okay, go and say no to all these things. There's actually a lot of anxiety that can come up because it's like, I don't really want to do that. And it feels like a loss. No, the thing is, I think that for us, with a lot of our to-dos and the things in our businesses and the things in our organizations, it can be the same way where we can look out and feel like everything is actually really important.
Yeah.
Our wants tend to, this sounds somewhat cliche, but it is the reality of that over time, our nice to haves become wants and our wants become needs. So we end up looking out and we're like, all these things have to get done.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is like with the decluttering, what sometimes can actually be the most helpful is if you're to say like, all right, just imagine you scrap everything. Like if you're in a business, imagine you say, I'm going to actually restart. I'm not doing any of this. What would be the number one thing I'd add back in? What would be the number two thing? What would be the number three thing? That actually changes the whole context because it's a way of kind of bypassing that emotional resistance that comes up.
Yeah. Well, I've fantasized many a time about almost jumping over the cliff to like eradicate my entire inbox, like just delete the entire thing and just start with a blank inbox. And I've like asked, what would be the cost of doing that? And then would I go back and pluck certain, not because any of these relationships are unimportant to me, but just especially insofar as emails become tasks, et cetera, at least in my world. So I have those those sort of thought experiments sometimes, and I haven't quite gotten the courage. / it might be completely irresponsible thing to do. There's so many different ways we could talk about clutter, but I do think there's this constant battle between the should versus this notion of interior peace, and what does it mean and look like to sort of accept some of these tensions and these sort of not being able to either be as self-improved as we would like to be or as peaceful or as whole as we would like to be, the sort of deltas between the ideal and the reality. I think some of what you're saying is just very, very wise. And to accept that doesn't mean to stop the journey of seeking to sort of figure out kind of what matters most. And part of the tricky thing when I used this word nudges earlier in introducing you is we don't live in a world that naturally kind of honors finitude and limits and like thinks in these ways. Like we don't actually live in a monk manual world. And monks have always been countercultural and have had some element of withdrawing to recreate a whole different set of habits that I think are in our day today can be very difficult to do all by yourself. We need the encouragement of others living by a similar logic. So anyways, just throwing a bunch of things into the Pandora's box there. I wanted to ask you how the Monk Manual enables us to think differently about time specifically. Because I have found that you're very respectful of time, and in the actual manual itself, you include the hours of a day. You organize it by months and weeks and days. And so I just would love for you to reflect a little out loud of if how because time for many of us can feel like such an enemy or a prison. And I do feel like if you are really using this properly, it has a way of kind of transforming our relationship to time. And it's a mystery to me.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So one thing you brought up in the introduction,
Yeah.
you were talking about time management.
Yeah.
I actually have been playing around. I haven't fully fleshed out kind of a model to explain this, but I think that a more helpful way to think about time is not so much time management, because I think that fits within the context of how we normally think of productivity. So productivity is actually really interesting. Productive skyrocketed in usage as a word around the Industrial Revolution. So when we think about productivity, a lot of it just comes from an industrial model. Whereas its original roots, same root word as produce, right? So it comes from more of an agricultural model. So, but I share that because this idea, this focus on production, it heavily impacts our experience of time, and this idea of time management, right? It's like we're running our lives like a assembly line, and we're trying to tweak. You could walk to a store right now, and there's going to be a business magazine about certain hacks to become more productive, right? So we think in a very kind of mechanized way about time.
Yeah.
And about reducing lossage of time. So that's time management. In some ways, I'd almost, from a financial modeling perspective, almost present that as like a kind of like an accountant that needs to make sure all the things fit in all the places. And it's actually about more about controls and eliminating risk and loss. I tend to think of what can be a more helpful model is actually thinking about time through like a lens of like time leadership. So a leader actually has to go and have a vision. They have to be responsible for things like culture, like saying yes, like saying no, leading something forward. And our time is, you could argue, the most valuable asset we actually have. And so this time leadership model is more like approaching time rather than an accountant, like an investor, and saying, what is the things I can do with my time now that's going to bring back the highest investment in my life, both it maybe in the present state as well as at a future state. Something that is really helpful for me, this is not explicit in the Monk Manual, but it might, there's a lot of things that aren't explicit in it, but they I think sometimes people like yourself actually can see some of it, like the shadow of it just in the work. Something that shifts a lot of the way of thinking about time for me. We have a very negative frame around time. What I mean by that is we think of time almost like sand going through an hourglass. So we experience time on a fundamental level as loss, right? As this thing, almost like something's being taken away from you, right? And some of us, actually, the people who really are trying to tap into the depths of life, really tap into the richness of it, might even feel that more, right? Like, for example, for myself, there's sometimes I've actually found that I will sometimes not avoid life, but avoid the depth of actually experiencing what's happening, because it's actually kind of painful, right? Like, to the degree I am with my children and I can really, really be there with them and really see it, there's such a profound almost beauty to it. That the awareness that that's actually passing is so painful that I think I actually tend to disengage because of that.
Well, that's deep, Steve. That's a deep observation. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I actually think people in your community probably tend to be more, because they're trying to probably go a bit deeper. There's a bit more maybe of a sensitivity to those things. There's in a more of a tendency towards, maybe that personal honesty. So those same sorts of things can come up. But what I've realized is what's more helpful for me as a model of thinking about time is, rather than these grains of sand passing down, it's actually like the sand is filling up. And what's happening is every moment that passes, we're choosing what our life ultimately will be filled with. So our life is not fading away; it's actually being created in real time, and we get to choose. There's a kind of a pregnant potential to every single moment, and we get to choose what that's going to be and to tap into that. And then at the end, that's our life, right? It's like every moment is a brushstroke for this canvas of our life, and the thing is like, on somewhat level, that doesn't resolve the fact that life ends, right? That doesn't resolve that fact that things are passing away. But I think it forces you to be brutally honest with the fact that, like, yes, there is loss. You can't do everything. You are finite, right? Which is difficult. Like you were just saying, we try to avoid that reality that life is finite. But if you can accept that life is finite, then you can decide, okay, what do I want to do with that? And then it turns you back towards agency. And I think creative potential, like that's something I'm really big into. And I think even the tension you experience around that, I think tension is often a really profound place for creative potential, right?
Yes.
So it's living in that tension and then being whatever you're doing. So this is one other element. One of the things that inspired me around the Monk Manual was this, what I perceived as, a lot of times I would feel like there's so many things that have to get done that I'd be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, right? It's like I didn't know where I was, but I wasn't there. Like wherever I was in the moment, I wasn't there. I was in my head. I was thinking about this thing that had to get done, or this report, or this email, or whatever it was. And what I noticed is in monasticism, again, in the East and the West, you have this structure where it's, hey, from 9 to 10, you're in manual labor, and then there's some sort of maybe meditation time or prayer time or whatever it might be. And what happens is there's such a clarity in that during that time, that's all you're supposed to be doing, right? Like for a monk, when they're in manual labor, they're not supposed to be, it's clear this is what it's supposed to be. And because of that, they can really be present, right? And so part of it is like recognizing that time is so valuable. Joseph Campbell, if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, he has this thing where he talks about, people will ask me, what happens at the end of life? Is there eternal life? And he goes, well, that's what you're describing isn't eternal. That's everlasting. That's you living forever. He's like, eternal life actually happens now, because eternal life is every present moment. So every present moment that passes by is eternally forever what it was forever. Like that is what it is.
That's the moment with your children.
Yeah. And so then it's like you try and lean into that, right? Like even on a very real level, like this will forever be what I did for this time, right? And whoever's listening, the same thing. And there's actually a beauty to that. There is some difficulty in, again, accepting that, but I don't think there's another alternative.
Yes. It actually reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Arrival with Amy Adams. Have you seen that film?
It's inspirational for me, actually. It's one of those films that I think actually shaped some of the ways I think about time. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, and I'm also cracking up because literally behind this little virtual podcast studio, my two favorite tools are your monk manual, which I have right here, and an hourglass of sand. Those are the two things that I kind of feel like are really good partners together. So I'm chuckling I'm like, do I view that sand as loss? I'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit sociology here. When was the monk manual launched onto the public market? What year?
Just about 4 years ago. So that would have been 2019, maybe.
Okay, so like you've too, a little like me, you've gained a little your leadership legs over COVID, and it's fascinating to have this through pandemic time. So as more and more people have learned about it, got a hold of it, loved it, used it. Talk to me a bit about the breadth of roles, as you're familiar with them, of the people who use it. Can the monk manual and this sort of way of life and set of principles be as serviceable in the life of a stay-at-home mom as a large company CEO, or like someone like me in the days of a writer versus someone who does carpentry for a living? I'd be curious how sort of universal, for lack of a better word, you've watched this across sort of social class and profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we do serve a very wide audience. I think that the way it translates differs depending on the use case. I wanted to actually create something that offered enough scaffolding or structure that it offered enough support, while at the same time not being something that was not flexible to work with a lot of different use cases. Where I find a really clear, immediate use case where a lot of people will thrive with it are people who are, if they're entrepreneurs, if they're leaders, if they're individuals who have maybe a sense that there's a high agency over their time, and also a high pressure around that time. Right. For them, they usually can hop into the monk manual. They're already aware that they have to prioritize. They have to be in charge of what they're doing. And so they hop in and they immediately can just be off to the races and usually see value very quickly. It's in some ways kind of a less steep on-ramp for that audience. We also, though, do have a lot of people who are, say, stay-at-home parents, right? We really have it all across the board. Retired individuals, students. So, I mean, the monk manual. So there's really multiple components. There's kind of a morning sort of routine, or I guess you could say it's a routine to get things started, kind of a preparatory routine for the day and the week and the month. And that's fairly universal. The reflection piece is fairly universal. That doesn't really change no matter who you are. Those are always going to apply. The time leadership management piece is where it can get a little bit trickier, because if someone, say, for example, is a nurse, them setting priorities for the day, it's going to be more difficult from a qualitative or concrete standpoint, like a project-based thing, right? So you could go and have this and say, I'm going to record this today, I'm going to do this other thing. But where you end up finding, and this actually can be, sometimes there's even people who are in businesses, professional settings, who will use the monk manual in this way. sometimes people use the priority section as a way to more so lean into qualitative ways of approaching life. So it might be one of my priorities is being present or patience, right? And what they're doing then is they're running kind of that background app all throughout the day where they're focusing on building a particular character trait or a particular virtue. Because in the benefit is, and this is the real hope that I have, is that in both those scenarios, what it's actually doing is it turning the person to deeper engagement in life. Because what happens is whether it's qualitative or more concrete quantitative, what it's doing is it's actually showing you that like you have agency in your time and in your day, right? Even if your entire day is just chosen for you, you still have a choice as to how you're going to show up in that.
Yes.
A lot of people will go and they'll hate meetings, right? But every meeting actually has a ton of opportunity, right? You could be trying to understand people better. You could be working on certain communication things. You could be trying to understand even power dynamics. There's a lot of levels upon which you could be going and engaging. And I think that's that way we honor the fact that our life is in some ways finite, is by just engaging it to the maximum ability, right? To just take it in as much as we can.
Yes. Yeah, that's very good. And I will say in the sort of priorities section, both daily and then on a weekly basis, um, I am hoping to mature to the place where I can list a little bit more of those qualitative things as something. I mean, just because of what I do for a living and maybe who I am, I do think about those things, but sometimes I'm like, why is it still all major important tasks and not something like deeper that's like the adverb of my life animating it all that I could. So I will get there hopefully one day. Steve, one of the things, I know I've just met you just now, but one of the things I've admired about your public leadership as someone who gets weekly texts of sort of meditations you put out on Mondays and the various communications that the Monk Manual community, for lack of a better word, puts out there that I receive in my inbox. And I get a lot of that kind of stuff. And I like uniquely pause over the Monk Manual thing, so that I just want to compliment you on I think, thoughtfulness and curatorial sense that you all have as you're recommending various articles and so on. But one thing I've admired about you is the ways in which you seem to be going further up and further in. Like, it's not like you've just created some successful product and then gone on to some other entrepreneurial venture. And if you did that one day, all the power to you. But I'm curious, like, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit, if we could peer under the hood of how you get nourished to try to maintain integrity with the gift that you've created for so many of us in modern times. It doesn't feel like you've hit a ceiling on what you yourself can learn in this being and doing integration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one piece is the Monk Manual itself is deeply personal for me. So it comes out of my own personal journey, and it deeply aligns with my own sense of, I don't know, like my own song to sing, I guess, right? Like this is, it feels very much just something that's deeply personal. And there's something that I think is commonly the case for individuals when someone ends up going through maybe a certain difficulty, and then they end up realizing, oh, like that doesn't have to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some of that in the mix where I feel that there's certain things that I was doing in particular ways that were kind of the common best practices or ways of thinking about things, and I ended up realizing that they were deeply flawed. And I see now how that impacts so many of us. And there is kind of a zeal of sorts to go and try and change that, right? To be almost like a voice crying out in the desert, and to try to present a different vision for what it looks like to be human. That sounds like a very dramatic way of putting it, but that is ultimately what it's about, is presenting a different a different vision. And so So part of it is when I'm doing the text and I'm trying to go kind of further deeper in with people. Part of it is it is deeply meaningful for me, right? Like just actually going and doing the work, even talking to you here, it's meaningful for me because I like talking about these things because I think it's important because it's been important for me.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is there are a lot of things behind the monk manual that are not explicit. What I mean by that is I started noticing this as a pattern that a lot of people would feel maybe a certain attraction to the tool, but couldn't really see why certain things were certain ways or what the intentionality was. There's you'd be surprised. There's a lot of people who say, for example, when they get to reflection, they'll be like, "This is a waste of time." Right now, the thing is it's reflection's not a waste of time, but there's a gap there. There's a knowledge gap,
Yeah.
and there's a lot behind the vision that just no one would really see, right? I think one of the things and one of the reasons we're able to go fairly deep into some of these different areas is because there's already probably some shared common premises and shared knowledge that we both have. And so we can talk a bit more fluently about some of these things and go right to the heart of the matter. But there's a lot of people, the vast majority of people actually have very little. I remember talking to someone at one point talking about monasticism, and they were asking me because they knew I was doing the monk manual, and I used the word monasticism, and they said, "What is that?" So even that word is not
Yes.
common for everyone, right?
Yes.
They're not familiar with the history. They're not familiar with the ideas. So trying to go and really build out. I actually think the gift moves beyond the tools. It's actually more so in the ideas than it is the tool. But I felt like the tool was a way, and the tools are ways for me to garner the trust in order to
Yes.
then be able to share the ideas. Uh,
Yes.
so
Yes, and I think much more powerfully, frankly, than if you were like a talking head talking about
yes,
the underlying premises. We talk a lot about institutions that comment, and that's a very unsexy word these days. Particularly, we're probably roughly around the same generation, I'm guessing, especially for our age group and younger. But one of my favorite definitions of an institution, for all the ways in which I think there's very legit reasons why a lot of institutions today, at least in the American context, are being distrusted, have so disappointed and betrayed people. Like, we need to reckon with all of that and stare it in the face and name it, and not try to continue to obscure it. So I'm on the side of doubting our institutions to some degree. However, I still believe in them, and I think they're important. One of my favorite definitions is institution kind of has a deep wisdom embedded within it that allows you to take so much for granted. And in some ways, I think what you're doing is creating, and you may balk at the word institution, but creating sort of there's a sociological word, habitus, which is like a way of being that is sort of rooted in some wisdom we can name. And me, and my role as a magazine editor, that is actually rooted in 2,000 years of Christian social thought. We're doing something similar, where a lot of what we're trying to put out there is narratives of praxis that are like capture people's attention and imagination, that may actually be rooted in some deeper, often ancient principles that human beings have discovered to hold true around how we flourish as individuals and with one another. But we don't have to spell all those out all the time. But there is nonetheless some rich undergirding underneath that, for those of us who may have philosophical interests, we like naming and discovering. So I think it kind of works at all levels, regardless of whether you're coming to it with knowing what monasticism is or not. And it's a wonderful way in, because you're experiencing the great help of it in your own actual life. So just I'll wrap up here. And thank you for sharing a bit of how personal this is to you. From that kind of, I think, personal mode, it seems like you have been able to create an actual community. And I was putting it in quotes earlier, but I actually sense that there is something, even if it's largely virtual, that there's kind of a monk manual type, or even there are people who are naturally that type, and those who have maybe come to like be so grateful for the ways in which they've changed and been formed by this tool. If you could use one phrase or word to sort of describe the thread that unites, say, the Monk Manual community. Is there one? What would it be?
Actually, I think it's generosity.
Ooh, interesting. I wasn't expecting that.
I wasn't either. I thought about it, and that's what came to me. This is the reason why, is because I think that uh, prior to recording today, I'd asked you the question about your own audience and the way you were describing your audience in terms of maybe being more leaders in various capacities, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's a big movement, but in some ways they're taking on the act of leadership, which is in a sense having a vision, uniting, weaving together this fabric, right? That actual act is an act of generosity. I think that leadership, when it's not driven by ego, when it's not driven by a need to prove something, but rather to share something, is fundamentally a life of generosity. It's looking at life and saying, I've recognized my life as a gift, and I want to go and give that life in the most profound way I can, not because I need to be profound for myself, but because it just feels appropriate.
Yes.
I would say that actually is my audience. I've said to many people, and I'll say it to my team. I feel like the people the Monk Manual serve are the best people on the planet Earth. There's maybe a little bit of hyperbole in there because there's a lot of people, but they're genuinely really good people. They've gotten some things right. If they've gotten to the point where they're looking at the Monk Manual, they've gotten some things right. They're usually asking questions about of what can I do with my life, right? How do I have deeper meaning? They're kind of they probably also even found that some of the different formulas of or programs for life that maybe culturally would commonly be promoted are not necessarily offering them the pathways to what they want. And so they're open. That even in of itself shows that there's courage, right? Because they're able to go and walk a little bit of a different path. So it's interesting because I serve people who are very, very different and even spiritually very, very different. What I mean by that is there's a lot of different religious traditions or lack thereof.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of it is, if I can maybe go through a theological lens as we're wrapping, I heard this example once shared that that there's an image in Eastern Orthodoxy where it's almost like God is the center. It's like a dot, right? And there's a big circle around that dot, and everyone's on different itineraries, in different relations to that dot. But what you end up finding is you don't get closer to the dot without simultaneously getting closer to all the other people getting closer to the dot.
Yes.
And you sometimes realize that actually the other people who are surrounding you might not look like you. They might not be from the same place as you, but you find these strange commonalities where in this place of depth, in this place even of stillness, you could maybe argue in a more like a contemplative approach to life, you end up finding a lot of commonality on maybe a heart level or a spirit level with a lot of different people. And there's a unity there that's quite profound and actually really uncommon. I would argue that a lot of the people in the Monk Manual feel more connected with other people in the community than they do even with maybe a particular church community or civic community that they're a part of, because they can feel somewhat isolated. They can feel like no one really is seeing this in the exact same way. And then to feel like you find that it's a bit of an oasis, which I think in some ways is what a monastery can be. The ideal of a monastery is that it's a sort of oasis. So
I cannot tell you. You just gave me goosebumps, Steve, on a couple levels. I think the beauty of that dot and the going closer to it, and then how the going almost closer to the vertical or going to the center thickens our horizontal relationships, but also what you just described about the oasis, and it overlaps so perfectly with exactly the feedback we get in our own audience about what we're trying to cultivate. So I feel in deep like cousin common cause with you. And I just want to thank you for coming on here today, and I'm grateful for all the kind of hard work and all the different journeys, personal and otherwise, that have led you to sort of, I think, so carefully steward something and create something that is helping me and helping many, many people, but in both a brilliant and a humble way, kind of, I think, restore the worlds of that we're tending to their most natural rhythm. And the last thing I just want to thank you for is I think there's something, you said something earlier about controls and variables, and I think the more I use this tool, the more I think it's giving me, you could call it maybe an Ignatian. I don't think it's only the Ignatian wisdom, but sort of a way of interacting with life, with the world, with people around me, with the broader social, political circumstances of our time, with this like way of dancing with it and being receptive to it, and sort of discerning that it's not just me, my own island, but somehow I feel like I have a ballast to engage the great adventure of life in a way that is deeply dynamic and listening and shifting, but not in a way where I'm losing a center. So thank you. And all best of wishes to you. May more and more people get exposed to this tool.
Thank you so much, Anne. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Person Revolution podcast, which is as much a cultural compass for comment as it is an incarnate witness of the hope we explore in our pages. Like what you heard? Check out this podcast's intellectual seedbed at www.comment.org, where you'll find an artistic rendering of essays that shed light on the very real shadows afflicting the peace of our commons today, but also the many cracks of light. And consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or you can suggest questions that are pressing upon your desire to be an agent of grace and truth and gentleness and trustworthiness. We want to hear from you, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at comment@cardis.ca and expect a sincere exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet Magazine, produced and with original music by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.